and I'm going to talk about Gebchak Nunnery. And Gebchak Nunnery is a Nyingma nunnery, Drukpa Kagyu Nyingma nunnery that's located in Nangchen, which until recently was a kingdom in Kham in eastern Tibet. And Nangchen is also called in Tibetan Gonde, which means the land of meditators. And it's been for many centuries a place where yogic culture has been very widespread, and you can say that the yogin was the cultural hero. And the first kings of Nangchen started in the 13th century. The first king was Lume Dorje, who was a Barum Kagyu Repa. He was a yogin following the Tummo tradition of Milarepa. And since then, yogic practice has been quite widespread. And so Gebchak Gonpa is located at 4,500 meters in a very remote valley, as you can see here. And it's presently a nunnery of 350 nuns who uphold a female lineage of yogic practice. The nunnery was founded in 1892 by Tsogyal Shedrub, who was a close disciple of the first Tsoknyi Rinpoche. And 1892 was the height of the Rime, the non-sectarian movement in eastern Tibet. And it was a time when minority lineages and groups of marginal practitioners like nuns were brought to the center, and it was at this time that the nunnery was established. So Tsogyal Shedrub established the nunnery and composed 16 volumes of commentary on a terma by Ratnalingpa. And these 16 volumes are commentary essentially on the Sangtri Rigna, which is like a terma version of the 6 yogas of Naropa. And he adapted these yogic practices for the female mind-body experience, especially for the nun practitioners at the nunnery. So within maybe 20 or 30 years of the nunnery's founding, you had up to about 800 nuns living there, and also many male yogis surrounding the nunnery and other Gonpa. So the way that the practices are adapted for the female experience, I can't tell you much about that. When you ask the nuns these kinds of questions, they're not usually very forthcoming, and I don't have the experience, but I was told by some of the lamas at Getchar that one way in which the practices differ is a female nervous system and psychophysical makeup means that experiences of yogic practices like Tummo or illusory body, when they appear, there's some subtle differences in the way those experiences appear. And also some of the, like the nadi, the meridians, in some cases are opposite for men and women. So Gebchak Nunnery is unusual for many reasons. Its practice tradition, the system of practice at the nunnery is distinct, and it's especially unusual and it's unprecedented in Tibet in being a completely autonomous lineage of female practitioners in a monastic setting. You had some autonomous female lineages of yoginis like Machik Labdron, but in monastic world it was quite unusual. So Gebchak Nunnery eventually flourished throughout the Nangchen kingdom, and it ended up with 27 branch Gonpa. And the nuns of those 27 branch Gonpa, 4 of them are monasteries, which means that Gebchak Nunnery has 4 branch monasteries, which is quite unusual in a Tibetan setting, where usually a nunnery is an annex of a monastery. And the nuns are autonomous in all aspects of their religious practice. All of the Tummo yoga, Dzogchen meditation, the ritual, liturgy, everything is taught by the nuns, to the nuns. And not only that, the nuns are also teaching to these 4 monasteries. So presently, a nun called Tenzin Chozom holds the Tsalung, the Tummo practice. She's the master of this practice, and she teaches also at these branch monasteries. Okay, so I'm just going to give you a brief overview of the practice system at the nunnery. So usually, a nun will join Gebchak Nunnery at about age 16 or 17. The first thing she needs to do is look after the nunnery yak. It's a very high altitude nunnery in a nomadic area. They have about 200 or 300 yak. So if the nun lasts for 2 years doing that task, then she can formally enter the nunnery's practice system. And it begins with the 4 mundro preliminary practices, so she usually will complete those in about 4 months. That's followed by 200 days of nyungne, which is a fasting practice of Chenrezig, the Buddha of Compassion. After that, she'll do a 7-month Vajrayana retreat, which is a protector deity. And in between these retreats, the nun is learning the ritual instruments, hand mudras, chanting, torma, ritual cakes, and so forth. And eventually, the nun will join a 3-year retreat. There's usually a lineup of nuns waiting to get a place in the 3-year retreat building at the nunnery. And the 3-year retreat at Gebchak Nunnery is actually one of a series of preliminary retreats We heard yesterday from Khenpo Kamalundup about the 3-year retreat curriculum. So typically in the 3rd year of a 3-year retreat, the practitioner is learning the 6 yogas of Naropa. It's unusual at Getchak because from the first day of a 3-year retreat, they're learning Tsalung and Tungkor, which we've heard about so far. So Tsalung is Nadi and Prana Yoga. It's like basic Tummo training. And it's accompanied usually by Tungkor, which is a Hatha Yoga practice of forceful movements to help clear the Nadi and the consciousness. So the nuns are practicing this from the first day of their retreat. And by the end of the 3-year retreat, they're considered proficient in Tsalung and Tungkor. After they finish the 3-year retreat, then a nun will join one of 16 retreat divisions. So these are based on the 16 volumes that were composed by Tsayan Gyamtso. And the nun usually will choose one of these 16 retreat divisions based on her own intuition and the guidance of a lama. And each of the retreat divisions is dedicated to a particular yidam, a personal meditational deity. So for example, Tara, Hayagriva, Tromanakmo, some of the Nyingma yidams are practiced in these 16 divisions. And so typically throughout a day, a nun will practice 2 sessions of sadhana to her yidam, and at least 1 session of yoga. Tsalung and Tungkor will be practiced daily. And as well as that, there are 19 drupchens that fall throughout the year. And a drupchen is an extensive sadhana group ceremony. It usually lasts about 10 days. All the nuns practice this together in the main temple. And one you might have noticed in these pictures, if you can see them, they're not very clear, but the nuns, from the time they enter the retreat system, they sleep and they practice in meditation boxes. These are called gomtri in Tibetan. And the principle, it might look like some kind of extreme asceticism that goes against the Buddhist teaching, but in fact, there's a good reason for these meditation boxes. And the principle is that when the spine is straight, the central channel is straight, and then consciousness becomes more clear. So the nuns are quite happy in these meditation boxes. They're deep and quite open, and they get a lot of blankets inside, so they curl up and they're able to sleep very well. But it means when they wake up in the morning, they haven't slept as deeply, so their mind is more awake, and they can just sit up and go right into a session of practice. So they're quite happy in these meditation boxes, and because they're doing yoga every day, their bodies are healthy. And so this is kind of an overview of the curriculum, but even in between all of the practices I've just described, if there is any free time, the nuns of their own volition go ahead and do, this is a picture of a drupchen here, which is a very heavy ritual, creative ritual group sadhana ceremony. And this photo here shows you, this is a hole in the ground where the nuns practice Tsogyal, which is one of the 2 components of Dzogchen training, very advanced Dzogchen meditation that's involving light and vision. And in the winter, the nuns like to do 100-day sets of meditation in these holes. And so you can see the practice system is really quite intensive. And for most of the nunnery's history, really up until the last few years, the nunnery was renowned throughout Nangchen and even further in eastern Tibet for the quality of the nuns' practice. If you've come across a book called Blazing Splendor, which is the memoirs of Tulku Urgyen Rinpoche, he was a Nangchen Dzogchen yogi, he dedicates a whole chapter praising the practice system at Getchak Nunnery. And so besides the 16 retreat divisions and the specialization the nuns have in Tsalung and Tummo, the nunnery is also unusual in having an annual chure ceremony. So chure means wet sheet. And every year, usually in January, on the full moon in January, which is typically the coldest day of the year, the nuns do this chure ceremony, which is a public demonstration of their accomplishment in Tummo. So it's able to demonstrate the outer signs, the bodily heat. It's an outer sign of their accomplishment. So the ceremony takes place just before dawn, in the early morning, and then the nuns exit the yoga hall and in a solemn procession do a kora, walk around the whole campus of the nunnery, which takes them about 45 minutes, and it's freezing cold outside. It's maybe 25 degrees, minus 25 or lower Celsius. And the nuns are practicing, they're walking slowly and doing their breathing and visualization of Tummo practice, and also very deep prayers to the Guru. So Guru Yoga, Guru devotion is the context of all of their practices. You could almost say it's the fuel of all of the practices at Getchak Nunnery, and of course of Vajrayana practices throughout the Himalayas. And so in 2000, I was very fortunate to be able to watch this ceremony. And so I joined a group of about 30 or 40 people, mostly nomad members of the nuns' families. up on the side of the hill, so we weren't allowed to go very close to the nuns performing this ceremony, and we were not allowed to take any photographs. In fact, at Getchak Nunnery, they strictly prohibit photographs of any tantric practices, which is tradition in Vajrayana. And so it was minus 25 degrees Celsius that morning, and besides the details I've just described to you, my most salient memory of that morning was how cold I was. It was painfully freezing cold. So the nuns are walking around for about 45 minutes, and at each of the 4 directions of the nunnery, the nuns have a sheet soaked in cold water and wrapped around their shoulders, and by the time they reach the next corner, they've dried off the sheet. So most of the nuns had dried off about 10 sheets in that ceremony. And in 2010, there were 85 nuns, 85 out of 350 nuns that were competent enough in the practice to perform the ceremony, which is very impressive. So it's the only nunnery today that has an annual, it's the only community, as far as I'm aware of, that has an annual Chure ceremony like this. And also in Tibet today, it's the only community that has such an intensive daily, lifelong practice of Tsalung and Tummo. And so Tsalung is a practice that's a support for the meditative insight. So the principle, as many of you will know, is that the mental consciousness or mind and prana are like a horse and its rider, so wherever one goes, the other follows. So by manipulating the prana through Tsalung yoga and correctly uniting the mind and prana in the central channel, and the bindu drops meet at the heart, there's a very profound experience of bliss and non-conceptual awareness. And this is then familiarized in their meditation. So this is simply a technology that supports their meditative insight. The next picture shows an elderly yogin who's since passed away. His name was Pema Dorje, and he's giving a nun mind-to-mind transmission, pointing out the nature of her mind in a very profound way. I was very fortunate to be watching this, and there weren't many words said. It was very quiet, and the nun sitting in front of him, a Getchak nun, she sat for many minutes and then started singing spontaneously songs of devotion, beseeching her guru to point out the nature of the mind, describing the nature of reality. And then again, they sat for about 10 minutes in silence. And so this kind of characterizes also what we heard yesterday from the Kempo about Kagyu, or practice lineages in general, that are really based on an oral transmission, mind-to-mind transmission of a qualified guru, and then the student's contemplative experience of that teaching. And so in the practice lineages of Eastern Tibet, traditionally contemplative experience, practice, and the guru's pith instructions were the highest learning principles. And certainly this is still the case at Getchak Nunnery. They're very determined to preserve their original practice curriculum. But to bring the nunnery now to the present, since the 1980s there's been an enormous revival of Tibetan Buddhism in China, contrary to what you might have heard. It's thriving in many ways, Tibetan Buddhism, Vajrayana Buddhism on the Tibetan plateau. You have communities like Larungar, Yachingar, Katok, Shedra, with thousands, sometimes up to 20 or 30,000 monks and nuns studying sutras and tantras and even Dzogchen contemplative training. So in many ways the revival is even thriving, but what I've observed in the last 10 years is a shift to much more degree-oriented study, scholastic study. So nowadays in Nangchen the shift is very obvious, because they used to mainly be practicing similarly to Getchak Nunnery, sort of contemplative traditions based on a guru's experiential instructions. Now the majority of monks and nuns in Nangchen are studying in colleges in Shedra, pursuing degrees as Kempos, Kenmos, Lopun, and Lopunma. There are hundreds and hundreds of Kempos and Lopunma nowadays, which is a modern phenomenon, because 100 years ago in the Rimé movement you had great Shedras like Dzongsar and Kato, which were major centers of scholastic study, but were by no means the standard model of monasteries in Eastern Tibet. But nowadays you have a government in China that's by doctrine scientific socialist, and religion is legal as long as it serves the state's socialist aims. You also have a modern Han Chinese audience, global audience, that is bringing in skepticism and critical approaches to knowledge. So you find the shift to scholasticism is really growing, and the expression of Tibetan Buddhism has become more rational. So nowadays, where the Getchak Nunnery used to be praised for the quality of their practice tradition, today they're criticized because they don't study dialectics enough. But this is ironic and also revealing, because the practice tradition at Getchak hasn't changed. They're very determined to preserve it. So these recent criticisms really bring into relief the change in society, the change in the view in Vajrayana Buddhism in Eastern Tibet recently. So to me, this just really raises a question, an open question that I think is important to a conference like this about tradition and innovation in Vajrayana, because it seems clear that contemplative experience, practice experience, defines Vajrayana. And when you have environments where a strong practice component is lacking, like nowadays in the monastic colleges of Eastern Tibet and in academic settings in the West, are we able to carefully and skillfully marry study and practice? So ideally, we want to have a good balance of study and practice as a Buddhist. But when you lack a prolonged retreat opportunity, the kind of knowledge that's gained through academic or rational study is in a way different than the contemplative knowledge, which I would dare say is mystical. So how can we have a healthy balance between the two in certain modern settings? Certainly this isn't the case in Bhutan, for which I deeply rejoice. So thank you very much.